I'm John C. Jack Herther. I graduated from North Carolina State in mechanical engineering and had taken reserve officers training, became a lieutenant in the Air Force during the ending few months of the Korean War. And there turned out to be an opportunity because many of the officers coming back from Korea had to stay longer, and they had signed up with MIT for a class of about a dozen Air Force personnel, and there's about 3 times that many Navy that were in a graduate level course under Dr. Draper called Weapons Systems, which was a combination of the Aeronautical Department and the Electrical Department, and consisted of essentially 2 full years of graduate training. It was almost all the coursework for a PhD. You needed, of course, the orals and the big thesis. I was doing a thesis for the Navy on a fire control system for protecting ships. Dr. Draper had become famous in World War II because he was the one that invented the idea of improving the gunner's aim for knocking down the kamikaze aircraft that the Japanese began to use. What he did was add a rate gyroscope so that as a gunner was optically tracking an aircraft, he added a range-only radar to correct for the fall of the bullet, and with you no longer had to depend on only tracers to hit the target, which was a very inefficient, and we lost a lot of ships. He developed this Mark 14 gun sight add-on, and they built 40,000. They were on every Navy ship, multiple gunners. And that essentially stopped the kamikaze attacks being so successful in the Pacific. And he is almost credited for winning the war for the Navy in the Pacific theater. I had a chance to go to either Caltech or MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, which is now called Draper. And I chose Draper. When I got there, we had to decide on a topic for a thesis the semester before you graduated, midway through. And we started working on a fire control system for the Navy that would track aircraft very much like the kamikaze mission, each time tracked through zenith. There was an extra gimbal added and so forth. It was a large piece of hardware mounted on the roof at one of the MIT buildings. Well, in doing the thesis, we had so much problems with it that we began to doubt we could finish the thing and graduate in June '55. So Draper had just received a contract from the Air Force to study the feasibility of a satellite reconnaissance system to take visual photographs, actually television, and transmit it down to the Earth. And we decided to tackle 3 problems. 1, the ascent guidance of getting it on orbit. Secondly, stabilizing it. And it turns out that a company that had been started by General LeMay right after the war, it was called the RAND Corporation. It was one of the original think tanks. Going back, we find that LeMay didn't start it for the obvious reason of the mission quality or how well it would do and how it would be a big improvement. He did it just to keep the Navy out of the mission area. I always thought that was funny. When you look back for the records, that was the real reason. So it was a bit startling. But anyway, RAND studied this for 10 years and hired experts, including other companies. And for the guidance and control, they had hired North American, which was at that time one of the biggest aviation aircraft companies. They did a very good job of studying all possibilities of guidance and of stabilization and so forth. And of course, my roommates and I picked the topics, and I chose the guidance first, and then the other guys did the other tasks. But at the end of it, the Air Force wanted to get started, and once we graduated, it became obvious that, to Draper at least, that we should be recommended to the project office that was just beginning to start a real program to begin trying to implement this by taking and issuing contracts for what today would be called the risk areas, to get confidence that you could piece together things later and build a system out of these many studies that would go on maybe for a couple of years. And we were doing that at Wright-Patterson, and about that time the missile program began to get hot because of the fear that the Russians were way ahead of us when they essentially had a review of our whole program, and it hadn't gone anyplace in many years. General Schriever had a review by the Congress to get funding to essentially create a Manhattan-style project, which he did on the West Coast. And he took the Atlas program and began to double up on 2 missiles, 2 nose cones, 2 guidance systems. His idea was you're not going to fail if you have a backup or a competitive alternate. And about that time, we were beginning to, in our studies of trying to pick a major contractor to put together a system for a universal satellite program that would handle payloads that would vary depending on the mission. And the RAND original mission was a television, a very low resolution and low bandwidth to get the data down to the ground. And because of security, it was always thought that it had to be on U.S. territory, or certainly even the interior of the U.S., which limited the amount of material you could get back. Well, this was plugging along at a slow rate, and I wound up giving a briefing to the Killian had just been promoted by Eisenhower to be his science advisor. And he leaned on Din Land, head of Polaroid, who was sort of the photo expert in the reconnaissance field in the highly classified Air Force. In fact, he's the one that originally they wanted overhead reconnaissance, and they started with a balloon program. The original balloon program took World War II cameras, which were fairly low resolution, probably 10, 15 lines per millimeter, and just put them in. They put them in almost 500 balloons and released them over Russia. Only about 20 or 30 got through. They were shot down or just fell down to the ground. And Boston University picked it up, the entire group. Well, this group began by inventing what they call the HIAC, the high acuity, high resolution camera for balloons, which was a panoramic. They built 3 of them and were flown from a carrier in the Sea of Japan to fly all the way over and be picked up in the west of East Germany. They all came down in the East Germany, and they got nothing for it. Eisenhower wanted pictures. He used them exclusively for picking landing sites and troop filler in and everything. And in fact, Dick Leghorn later founded ITEC, who had been a P-38 pilot and flew very low missions and got a lot of the early photos that were so prevalent. After the war, was participating in the Bikini Atoll atomic tests. And he assembled a lot of the people that were in the reconnaissance field during World War II. There were 12 aircraft loaded with photographers with cameras of all sorts, and they saw an atomic explosion that actually raised a battleship. I mean, it was that powerful. And all of them at that time pretty much decided that they wanted to do something with photography to really prevent another atomic attack or any more use of atomic weapons. So the ITEC was formed because BU, like Harvard, didn't want to do defense work anymore. They didn't want to be involved in the kind of thing that went on with the aircraft carrier. So anyway, ITEC was formed, and I had given a briefing in October and on the status of the ascent guidance and the stabilization to the Killian Committee. And that's when the decision was made that the photographic approach using the readout techniques, television, was not sufficient, and it was going to be too slow. That's when they initiated a spin-stabilized camera not my type of stabilization. And we're going to recover the film because the reentry buckets for taking back the atomic warheads were perfected enough, and they figured if you can bring a warhead back, you can bring a canister of film back. That basically was the sort of the breakthrough that everybody kind of woke up once that was a proven technology. So they started that. In the meantime, I gave the stabilization, and apparently it was at that time that Leghorn went to Draper, and Draper, I skipped one step, and in August of that year, I had already been approved to go back to school to MIT for a PhD and finish it. And I went to see General Ritlin in August, and to make arrangements for getting out of my current job and have some replacement. He said, son, you're not going to be able to go to that. He says, you're going to have to see this program through, and then you can go to MIT. That was the way he left it. General Ritlin had been in charge of the U-2 reconnaissance program. I didn't even know it at that time, but that was the word he gave. Well, Sputnik flew in October, and right after that, they wouldn't let me get released for the Air Force, but I gave this briefing. Leghorn was there, and he offered me a job, and the Air Force suddenly let me out. So I got out on December 12th of '57, and we drove back to Boston, and I started work right when I got there. And that's when Leghorn says they've got a spinner camera, but we want to put a balloon camera, scaled up bigger focal length. We want to put that and fly lower. So we want to get a factor of 3 less altitude. The old saying, if you want to get close-up pictures, get close up. So we're going to fly at 100 miles, not 300 miles, which the TV program had to fly at 300 miles. Ironically, the reason was the RAND Corporation, in order to justify satellites way back over 10 years earlier, had decided you wanted constant illumination to be able to operate for a whole year. So that meant you wanted an orbital plane that rotated around the sun at 360 degrees a year, 1 degree per day. So you'd have constant illumination as well as you can do it, except for the latitude effect. And of course, that became a 300 nautical mile near polar orbit. And it turns out an 83-degree retrograde orbit at 300 miles is just right to achieve that, this RAND number. So anyway, that was the basis for me being transferred out. And in fact, there was a little pin made up that showed in an unclassified way the 3 of us that were the so-called space cadets. It showed the pole of the Earth with orbital tracks going around it at essentially 7 degrees off the pole. So it became an unclassified symbol of the original Air Force program, and that's something I cherish because of the fact that there were only 3 of us that got them. So. And that was a very derogatory term. As we were working in a bunch of missile guys, they thought the satellite guys were just nuts and wasting time and money and everything else. It was space cadet was not an endearing term. A proposal was written to take the balloon camera that was unsuccessful, stabilize it, and ITEC got the camera, and that was ITEC's first contract. And we built cameras from '60 to 1972, 12 years of Corona cameras, roughly 144, sort of one a month. They weren't actually done that way. But there was a major camera development right here in Lexington. And one of the things was it was declassified by the CIA so much that in '95 it was declassified by Al Gore and Bill Clinton on the grounds that it has no more reconnaissance value, and it may as well be used for environmental studies like shrinkage of lakes and things like that. And there was 200 people had a celebration celebrating the Corona declassification in Washington. I was invited. I was with Leghorn. He says, "So you weren't even mentioned." He said, "You know," and I said, "Well, I didn't even know any of those people. They weren't there then. I had left and gone into another field." And so he said, "We're going to have another celebration the day, roughly a year later, the day the first film was recovered. And so he invited Khrushchev's son, who was a professor at Brown. And in fact, I have a picture here of Khrushchev and his wife, Elaine and I, and Dick Leghorn, that were at this ITEC celebration. Later, Miter, who had nobody really had been involved in the early space work, I wrote a paper, and it's about 20 pages of the history of the Air Force reconnaissance program, because all throughout this, the written word was not allowed. All decisions on starting these programs were made verbally, and I happen to have in my folder essentially every briefing that I had been involved in. I had the names and the topics, which were unclassified. Well, I gave those to the National Reconnaissance Office, and they were able to trace through and re-interview 40 years back people that were still there and piece together the history of the reconnaissance program. And then I made another one about the history of the stabilization portion of it, which is available now. It can be still published. But again, nobody ever heard about it because it's $1,500 just to get a soft copy offline if you're foreign. So it didn't get much distribution. Nobody knows all this I'm telling. That's why it's, as I used to say, for almost 35 years, nobody knew what I was doing. Elaine had no idea. And she says, now that it's declassified, you won't shut up. Finally, well, I met Priscilla here, and the fellow that was the editor worked at Draper Lab. And some of the material that I'd written in that finally got in there. MIT was finally recognized as the old instrumentation lab as making a contribution. And in it is a picture of the Agena and the story of what role I had and what role they had. So this was 2 years ago when Priscilla was here. She's probably the only one that recognized it, because when I told you I was working on a Navy project, it was the one she was involved with. I remembered her boss's name and all the guys in the team, and it was really a coincidence that finally showed up in the 80th anniversary of Draper Lab. And that's the first time they got recognized for even being involved. Lockheed, MIT had to build 3 units. I got them to build the first 3 flight units. Lockheed took all the credit and gave MIT. MIT wasn't even mentioned in any of us. So that's the way it goes.